Hungary is caught in a paradox. Just a decade ago, it was Europe's model of recovery following the financial crisis. But these days, it's the country with the lowest growth rate in the region, an economy that seemed to be rebounding strongly, and now is faltering like a giant with feet of clay. Because of this, its president, Viktor Orban, could be experiencing the beginning of the end, and it's no surprise. Orban is the European champion of staying in office. He's remained in power for 15 consecutive years since regaining power in 2010. His secret? Winning elections without breaking a sweat, thanks to an electoral system designed to suit him. With it, he achieved overwhelming majorities in parliament and absolute power to carry out all his policies. Even so, his popularity cannot be denied. Orban was not only acclaimed for being the champion of the far right, but also for having boosted the Hungarian economy like a rocket. How? Well, with some rather creative measures. He raised taxes on large foreign corporations, particularly banks, and nationalised the private pension system. But he offset all this by giving families huge tax breaks. And surprisingly, the plan seemed to work. In 2013, GDP skyrocketed. Hungary repaid its debt to the IMF, boasted a surplus in its public accounts, and its debt was once again traded on the markets. This combination of economic results and conservative policies turned Orban into a veritable election-winning machine. Yet, in 2022, everything came to a screeching halt. GDP has been completely stagnant for 3 years now, and the forecasts are getting worse and worse. And it's precisely in this environment that news like this has emerged.
Viktor Orban's Fidesz wins European elections with its worst result.
In the 2024 European elections, Orban's party won 44% of the vote. That may sound good, or at least it does until we remember that in the general elections just 2 years earlier, it had won 52%. In other words, a significant drop for someone accustomed to sweeping victories. But what really set off alarm bells in Budapest was not the loss of votes, but who the votes were lost to. His new rival, TISZA, a party created just a few months before the elections, and which, against all odds, achieved a spectacular 30% of the vote. So who's the architect behind it? Peter Magyar, gossip alert, ex-husband of Orban's former justice minister. So basically, he knows the leader's weak points inside out. Ahead of next April's legislative elections, polls put TISZA at 46% of the vote. In other words, 9 points ahead of Orban. Is this really the end for Orban? What exactly has happened to the economy over the last 3 years? This is the most important question, because the economy threatens to achieve what no opponent has managed in 15 years, to send the leader to the opposition. But let's examine if that's really likely as we get into today's questions. What is the real state of the Hungarian economy? Why has it come to a screeching halt? Could Orban really lose power? In order to understand Hungary's current situation, we first need to talk about Orbanomics, Viktor Orban's economic formula since he returned to power in 2010, which allowed him to lift the country up very successfully. And it's no wonder. Orban has returned to power in the midst of a financial crisis. Hungary was in dire straits. It had needed to borrow 25 billion euros from the European Union, the IMF, and the World Bank. And that was precisely his #1 goal: to pay back the debts, adjust the deficit, and in passing, maximize short-term growth without worrying too much about the future. After all, a politician never knows if he'll be re-elected. So how did he do it? Orban started with a real tax revolution. First, he introduced a flat income tax rate of 15%. Then, he lowered corporate tax to one of the lowest rates in Europe. The problem is that this reduced revenue, so he had to compensate for it. But how? Easy, with the highest VAT on the continent at 27%. And that wasn't all. He also squeezed multinationals with a temporary tax due to the crisis. And you know what they say, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary tax. What's more, Hungary was flooded with money thanks to European cohesion funds. Hungary is a European champion in receiving money from Brussels. It has been the 4th largest recipient of EU funds, behind only Spain, Greece, and Poland. Now, while having all those resources is important, knowing how to spend them is even more so. And this is where one of the pillars of Orbanomics came into play: centralizing decisions and directing money to friends, allies, and even family members. And so Orban not only governs, he buys loyalties. strengthens his patronage network, and secures an army of grateful stomachs. A textbook case is Lorink Mezzaros. In just 5 years, he went from being a wealthy businessman to becoming the richest man in Hungary. His secret? Public contracts galore. He's not the only one. Orban's son-in-law, for example, has also known how to take advantage of his family tree. And do you remember Matolcsy, the brand new finance minister who helped Hungary overcome the financial crisis? The collaboration between him and the prime minister was so close that Orban publicly called him his right-hand man. Well, at the beginning of the year, he had to resign from his position as governor of the Hungarian central bank due to the disappearance of 1 billion euros from the institution's assets. In other words, Hungary could be considered the very definition of crony capitalism. In recent years, no fewer than 10 points of GDP have been spent on stimulus programs and subsidies, a feast that, according to many experts, has been a veritable corruption machine and has left the private sector as competitive as a snail on roller skates. The problem is that although such stimulus measures can be useful in times of crisis, they cannot be maintained forever. Orban was lucky. He ruled during a decade of very low interest rates following the global financial crisis. But since 2021, the music has changed. Rising interest rates, coupled with the war in Ukraine and rising energy prices, made maintaining these policies extremely expensive. Against this backdrop, Orban had to face the 2022 elections. So what did he do? He put his foot down on the fiscal accelerator, an ultra-lax fiscal policy that would ensure his re-election. All this was possible thanks to his almost absolute control of parliament, which allowed him to approve and tweak budgets with virtually no oversight. The result? Well, exactly what you see in this chart. As in much of Europe, inflation in Hungary skyrocketed following the flood of stimulus measures to combat COVID. But in Orban's case, there was an extra incentive to ensure his re-election. The result was embarrassing, 26% inflation, and it didn't return to single digits until almost 2024. And here's the most interesting part. Do you know who was most affected? That's right, those who form the electoral base of Fidesz, Orban's party, low-income families. In recent years, the prices of basic foodstuffs, essential goods, and housing have skyrocketed, and not surprisingly, patience is running out. More and more Hungarians doubt that Orban can get the economy back on track for growth, especially when they look at neighbouring Poland, which expects to grow by 3.3% by 2025. To make matters worse, Hungarian debt interest already accounts for 5% of GDP, the highest percentage in the entire European Union. And what has the government done to fix it? Well, it's followed the manual, but the wrong one. To curb inflation, it resorted to a measure that has accumulated 4,000 years of failure: price controls on basic commodities. The problem? Companies react by raising the price of other products, or simply stop selling them. The result? Empty shelves. Like a good populist, Orban went so far as to threaten supermarket chains with limiting their profits if they didn't agree to maximum prices for some of their products. He also raised the minimum wage and pensions by law, attempting to compensate for the loss of purchasing power among the most vulnerable. The verdict? These measures sound good in headlines, but are pure feast for today and famine for tomorrow. Economic history is full of examples of how such policies create more future problems than solved ones in the present. The feeling on the street is clear. Orban has run out of ideas, and is now just putting band-aids on a ship that is already taking in water everywhere. Nevertheless, Orban's economic and monetary policies are not solely to blame for Hungary's stagnation. The problem runs deeper. It's the model of a country that he has built during his 15 years in power. One of his flagship projects has been to re-industrialize Hungary. And yes, we can already guess the question. Isn't re-industrialization a good thing? Donald Trump wants to do the same thing in the United States. Well, it depends. Not every industry-based economy is good by definition, just as not everything in the service sector is bad. The problem for Hungary is that Orban has focused on industry, yes, but on the parts of the production chain that generate the least value, and he's done so by following the same formula. Generous subsidies and currency devaluation to attract investment that is basically looking for cheap labor. Instead of investing in key components, research, or development, he's focused on creating low value-added jobs. His public policy policy priority has been employment, at the expense of almost everything else. And when it came time to cut spending to meet the deficit, do you know what was one of the first items to go? That's right, education. In this context, skilled jobs for Hungarians are almost as rare as a unicorn in Budapest. The parts of industry that do require advanced knowledge have been left in the hands of foreign companies, with subsidies and tax exemptions as a welcome gift. Within the country, on the other hand, the contribution is simple: to be the cheap factory of Europe. And many of these subsidies come from European funds that are not always spent wisely, and that's putting it mildly. Let's just say that the rules for their use are relaxed, to put it diplomatically. A textbook example of this industrial policy: the automotive industry. Hungary is one of the Eastern European countries most dependent on the automotive sector. For years, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly those of the Visegrad Group, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, have been closely linked to the German automotive industry. Germany is their main investor and trades more with them than with China and the United States combined. In other words, the relationship was so close that if Berlin sneezed, Bratislava and Budapest caught the flu. All this worked wonderfully, while German industry was running at full speed. But these days, with many companies suffering and tariff policies such as those of Trump, that dependence is beginning to take its toll. In Hungary, for instance, Audi employs 11,000 people at a plant in the east of the country, and Mercedes employs another 5,000 in the south. And with the cuts being implemented by virtually all car manufacturers, it's only a matter of time before some of them reduce their workforce or close down altogether. Faced with this risk, Orban has found a new partner to cushion the blow: China, the same Asian giant that is looking for production plants in Europe to avoid EU tariffs on Chinese cars. And Orban wants his country to take advantage of this situation. In May, BYD announced that its European headquarters would be in Hungary. China's CATL, one of the world's largest battery manufacturers, also plans to open a plant there. For now, these are just announcements, but for Orban, they have been like a lifeline. In a country where most institutions are at the service of the government, investing is a very risky game. The question is, will this alliance be more reliable than his other international ventures? For example, his unconditional support for Donald Trump has not earned him any special treatment. Hungary will have to swallow the same 15% tariffs as all the other European countries, and his closeness to Vladimir Putin raises more than a few eyebrows in Brussels. Added to this is the fact that the European Union is blocking 18 billion euros of next-generation funds because Orban refuses to implement the reforms demanded by the Commission. In other words, between a Germany in crisis, an EU that is cutting off its funding, and a China whose commitment remains to be seen, Orban's international chessboard looks like a house of cards waiting for the next gust of wind. But truth is that the future of Hungary's next leader looks uncertain, to say the least. Peter Magyar presents himself as the reformist who promises to do what Orban hasn't wanted to do: implement the reforms demanded by Brussels, unblock European funds, and completely overhaul the country's production model.
Peter Magyar. If TISA wins, Hungary will once again be a reliable NATO ally and a full member of the EU.
Orban, for his part, portrays him as a puppet of the EU, a Trojan horse for imposing Brussels' social policies on immigration and the presence of the LGTB community. And what does Magyar propose to change course? Some ideas sound good. Eliminating indiscriminate subsidies, truly committing to high value-added industry through education, and burying crony capitalism. Because right now, in Hungary, many business people believe that it's more profitable to have coffee with Orban's circle than to innovate or compete in the market, which means that productivity is not increasing and the country continues to be doomed to provide cheap labor to foreign companies. Meanwhile, other measures such as raising the minimum wage or increasing taxes on the wealthiest raise more doubts about their viability. In any case, unseating Orban is no easy task. Over the past 15 years, he has woven a network of patrons that is difficult to escape, but which devours resources at the same time. And his reforms to the electoral system make it almost impossible for an alternative majority to wrest control from him. Even outside the government, he could block anyone who tries. As if that were not enough, he has the entire machinery of the state at his disposal to launch it against his rival. The independence of the judiciary in the country is in question, and the Prime Minister controls many media outlets. outlets. At this point, let me ask you, do you think the economy will be what ultimately brings Orban down? Will we see a change of course in Hungary, or will everything continue as it has up until now? You can leave your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and click on the bell icon so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, click a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers, I'll see you next time.